So in her book, excellent little book, conversational book, Redeeming Sex by Deborah Hirsch, she tells a story. Her friend, who's a pastor named Tom, was at a coffee shop one day, and a distraught young man came in and came up to him. This guy is brand new in his faith and comes to this pastor with a problem. He says this, "Pastor, I have a problem," he said to Tom. "I accepted Jesus into my heart a few months ago, and it is wonderful. I go to church every Sunday morning, but in the evenings I have wild, promiscuous sex." Tom said, the guy then asked him something that he'll never forget. "I've accepted Jesus into my heart, but how do I get him into my penis?" That just got said in church. Because that, despite the lexical simplicity of it, is a good question. How we answer that question gets to the core of what we believe about our own sexuality. How we answer that will form how you live, how you relate to one another. It'll form our families. It'll form your view of God and yourself. If I may reword it so I don't have to fire myself, what does having Jesus in my heart have to do with what I have in my pants? Or perhaps better, how does giving my life to Jesus affect how I give myself sexually to others? As it turns out, that's not just a good question. That is a biblical question. That is a question that the Corinthians are asking in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and that's a question we're going to look at today. So today, just to place us on the map here, we are in a series called More Than Sex, and so for the past 2 weeks, we've been laying this foundation. We've been talking what I called Biblical Sex Ed, 101 and 102. Right? So for the first 2 weeks, they've been preparing us for what is to come, which is now 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and chapter 7. And so for the next 5 weeks, we are going to walk through, line by line, the clearest, most explicit teaching on sex and sexuality in all of the scriptures. Which brings us to this topic: prostitutes, Jesus, and the members of your body. Members. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 12 through 20. Before we dive into this, though, some of you are new to this series, new to this conversation, I want to bring us up to speed real quick. I want to just point out the fact that it's worth noting that of all the New Testament churches that the Apostle Paul was involved in, Peter was involved in, John was involved in, of all the New Testament churches, this is the only church anyone ever felt like they had to sit down and give this sex talk to. Like, don't get me wrong, other places talk about sex, but this is the only place you are going to find this clear, explicit sex talk, which begs the question, what's the deal with Corinth? Right? What's going on in Corinth that makes it so special? Why does Corinth need this sex talk? So if you're new to this series, this will be all new. If you're not, this might be a reminder. Let's place ourselves here. Historically, Corinth is a Roman colony. So in 146 BC, the Romans utterly destroyed it. It was a Greek state, Greek city-state. And then 146 BC, the Romans utterly destroyed it and then set vacant for like almost just over 100 years. Then 44 BC, Julius Caesar said, hey, we need a city there. This is going to make a difference. We can use a city there. So he rebuilds Corinth to this glory, grandiose glory of Rome. And then when the Apostle Paul visits this, he's writing this letter around 53 AD. So it's had about 100 years of growth during that time. And by the time Paul writes this, it is the largest Roman colony in the world. So, 2 implications for what we're talking about. The first is this: tens of thousands of people live in Corinth, but nobody's from Corinth. Nobody's like from Corinth, like their families. There's not generational families. So in a world of landed aristocracy where wealth was tied up in these aristocrats who owned the land, Corinth is this geographical oddity here. Like when you look at Corinth, it is the one place in like the whole ancient world where you can actually live the American dream. You can show up and you can get your piece of the pie. You can make wealth because it's not already locked up in some landed aristocracy. As a result, young, ambitious go-getters from all over the Roman Empire swarmed to Corinth. The second thing I want you to think about is that it is Roman. It's in Greece, but it is a Roman colony. So in Corinth, it is socially, politically, economically beneficial to look Roman, talk like a Roman, and have sex like a Roman. So we don't have time to outline Roman sexual ethics, but here are two samples that might give us a taste. So Cicero, you may have heard of him, famous Roman orator, politician, moral leader of ancient Rome. He explains that if there's anyone at his time who thinks that youth should be forbidden from having affairs with prostitutes, they are being ridiculous. And then he goes on to explain, listen to this. Forbidding young men from sleeping with prostitutes, this is the topic, is contrary not only to the freedom of our present age, but even with the habits of our ancestors and with what they used to consider allowable. For when was the time that men did not act in such a manner? When was there such conduct found fault with? When was it not allowed? Like when? When did young men not want to sleep with prostitutes? Of course it's okay. All right, Roman leader number one. Sample number two, Plutarch. May or may not have heard of him. Famous Roman author, philosopher, moral leader. And in his work on morality, all right, this is a work on morality. He gives us this gem of marital advice. He explains, if a wife finds that her husband is having sex with another woman, she should feel, get this, respected. All right, now listen to this logic. If his wedded wife ought not be indignant or angry, but she should reason that it is respect for her that leads him to share his debauchery and licentiousness and wantonness with another woman. Of course, as the story goes, Plutarch was killed in 120 AD after telling his wife, "You ought not be angry." What's he thinking? Okay, so this is the Roman world, though. These are moral leaders of Rome. Plutarch, Cicero, this is their advice on sexuality. So that gives you the Roman context for what we're talking about in Corinth. Of course young men sleep with prostitutes. Of course it's respectful to your wife to not do that to her, but to do that to other women. Roman morality. The next thing is geography. Corinth is right there in that middle of the middle of the Mediterranean Sea there. I've got it kind of circled. Here's a close-up. It's the key point there is it's on this isthmus connecting two harbors, east and west. So all the sailors crossing the Mediterranean had a choice to sail around the Peloponnese of Greece and risk death, or pull into the harbor there and take a couple-week vacation while all their supplies got hauled over the isthmus, and then they would pick it up again. And so, as you might imagine, they chose that. As a result, all the transportation, like it's the O'Hare of the ancient world. Just imagine boats, right? Instead of planes. All the wealth of the entire empire passes through this one little spot, making Corinth stupidly wealthy. And all the sailors and businessmen of the Roman world pass through this one point, making it famously sleazy. All right? Just the cottage industry, adult industry becomes massive there because all these men looking for a good time away from their wives in the middle of the Roman Empire on a business trip. There you go. Third, so we saw historically, geographically, now spiritually, Corinth was very, very spiritual, but in a sense, in a way that sounds very unspiritual to us. Their spirituality was explicitly sexual. So they had temples everywhere, all over the city. There's something like 30-some temples or sacred spots just going up to the top of that hill there. But at the literal and spiritual summit of Corinth, you have that high place called the Acrocorinth. And if you go all the way up to the top, it takes a long time. I would suggest driving. And then you hike. Again, it's another hour hike from even after the driving. You get up there, and this is what you see. It's the temple of Aphrodite. At the very pinnacle of Corinth is the temple to the goddess of sex. At one time, there were said to be as many as 1,000 sacred prostitutes who worked that temple. So let's put all this together here. You have tens of thousands of young people, highly ambitious young people, swarming to Corinth, away from mom and dad, away from the constraints of family. You add in this massive adult industry, and then you make casual sex normative, even economically, politically expedient. Like, if you're a good Roman, you act like a Roman. You go to the temple just like everyone else does. You put all this together, and you get Corinth, which is a just city pulsating with sexual energy. Corinth got such a reputation that the people in the Roman Empire at the time actually took the word, and some of you will recall this, they made it into a verb, to Corinthianize, which means basically to have illicit sex with anyone and everyone. All right? So this is Corinth, ancient Corinth. Now we enter into this, and then we find the Apostle Paul shows up there, and he plants this church around 50, 51 AD. He's there for 18 months and enter Christianity into Corinth, Corinthian culture, Corinthian views of sex. And the clash between Christianity and Corinth is just going to be monumental here. So let's put this in context. There's a famous writing 120 AD, one of the earliest Christian writings outside of the scriptures we have. It's called the Epistle to Diogenetus. It's written by a guy named Mathetes, which is actually not a name, it just means disciple. So some Christian leader is writing to this guy, the most excellent Diogenetus, and Diogenetus is a Roman who's very, very curious about this Christianity thing, like this new thing called Christianity. Why are all these people following this crucified Messiah? This is so weird to him. And so in this epistle, he starts writing all these things about this is what Christianity is like. This is why Romans are attracted to it. And in chapter 5 of this epistle, which is just beautiful and worth looking up, by the way, we get this description of Christianity, and the author says, you know, it's not the language, it's not the clothing, it's not the culture that makes Christians. It's not what distinguishes them one from the other. But he says there are a few things we should look at that are radically different than Rome. And his famous quote, among others, though, is this: Christians, they have a common table, but not a common bed. Now, let me explain this to you. In ancient Rome, this is completely, radically contrary. Like in ancient Rome, they were very, very, very particular about who they ate with. Because to open your table cost you so much money. It was expensive. And two, it was about social order. It was about relationships. It was about business partnerships. So if you ate with someone, that suggested that you were in their class. They were very, very particular about who came to their table. But when it came to sex, well, they would bed just about anyone. Didn't matter. Didn't matter your class, slave, free, boy, girl, many, few, one. Didn't matter. They would bed anyone, but their table they protected. And the Christians, this epistle says, is they're just the opposite. They would invite anyone to their table. You can be in relationship with me. I will share my money with you. I will be generous with you. I will open up my life to you, but I will not share my bed with you. Inverted. This was radical, countercultural, unheard of. So when we get to Corinth, we find that these new Christians in Corinth, they are struggling with this. So in chapter 11, you know what the problem is? They don't want to open the communion table to everyone. Like some of the rich people, they want to eat on their own, and then some of them are eating over here. Like they're separating. Like they don't want to open the table to everyone. Because you know what that means if I ate with you? Like that means I'm at your level. That's weird. But they also struggle with closing off their bed from other people. And that's what we see in chapter 6. So 1 Corinthians chapter 6, starting in verse 12, reads like this. I have the right to do anything, you say, but not everything's beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but I will not be mastered by anything. You say, food for the stomach and the stomach for food, and God will destroy them both. Now, before we dive into this, I want you to notice something here. There's quotations here that we think, as far as the scholars think, they suggest it appears that the Apostle Paul is quoting the Corinthians in this passage, and possibly in verse 18 as well. That's up for grabs. I don't think so. Some do. But it says right here, they think that Paul is quoting the Corinthians as saying, I have the right to do anything, and food for the stomach and the stomach for food. God will destroy them both. I say it only appears that he's quoting them because we can't be certain. We're pretty sure, but we can't be certain because in ancient Greek they didn't use quotation marks. And those words, you say, that were in the text we just read, those aren't original to the Greek. Those are added for clarity's sake by the translators. We cannot be certain, but there is very, very good reason to believe that these were actually Corinthian slogans. Like these were just things that got said around town. Like this is what you would say in the church. And the Apostle Paul, remember, we're only hearing half of a conversation here. He receives a report and a letter from Corinth. He's in Ephesus. And then from that, in response to that, he writes a letter back. So right now, we're only hearing half the conversation. We think that he's quoting them there. And I want you to look at exactly what the Corinthians seem to be saying and see if it sounds familiar. The first quote is this: I have the right to do anything, by which they seem to mean being a Christian means we live in freedom. Having sex or not having sex does not make me a Christian. Therefore, I can do whatever I want. So, get this. In one sense, I want you to hear this. I want you to hear this carefully. In one sense, the right. In fact, some scholars think that they're not just quoting something said around Corinth, but they're actually quoting the Apostle Paul. If you read Colossians chapter 2, Galatians chapter 5, you will find things like Paul saying, it is for freedom that Christ sets us free, that you live in freedom, that there is something to this, that the gospel is not about what you wear or what you eat or practicing religious ceremonies or following moral rules. So you apply this to sex, and it says, never has anyone not gotten into heaven because they have too much sex. Never. And never has anyone gotten into sex, or gotten into sex, yeah. Gotten into heaven because they didn't have sex. Lots of people have gotten into sex, just to clarify. The point is that the gospel is not about sex. It's not. It's not the deciding factor. Jesus is. So the bad news is you can never earn your way into heaven. You will never be able to win God's love. You will never be able to make yourself into someone. That's the terrible news. But the good news is you don't have to. You don't have to. Jesus earned it for you. He won this for you. He gave his life so that you can have his life. You never have to earn it. He gives it. You can't earn it. It's by grace alone we're saved. So, if salvation is a gift, if my righteousness is a gift, if heaven is a gift, then that means you're free. You're free from trying to win God's approval. You're free from the fear of sin, death, hell. You are free from all the constraints that you're putting upon yourself. You're free to have a meaningful life. This is true. But it appears, though, that the Corinthians then take this good news that we are free from the power of sin and death, and they use it to justify, in their words, anything. And by anything, they mean sleeping with prostitutes. So Paul, listen how Paul's going to handle this. Listen how he's going to handle this. He's not going to deny their freedom because that would be against the gospel. The gospel is not slavery. It's not. It's freedom. But they have the wrong definition of freedom. So the Corinthians, like the Americans, like us, seem to think that freedom means I can do whatever I want to do. If I want to do it, I can do it. And that's their simplistic definition of freedom. So sexual freedom looks like doing as much as I possibly can. The only question the Corinthians have is this: what am I allowed to do? Or in the American terms, how far can I go? So years ago, I was a youth worker down in Dallas, and at a church, young men, you know the drill. I'd lead them in Bible study. They get in a romantic relationship, and what's the first question they come to their Bible study leader with? How far can I go? How far is too far? And they want it to be exact. They want like diagrams, if possible. Like, can you draw me a picture of a woman's body and show me safe zone, danger zone? How far is too far, right? And I would sit down with them and like, I totally get it. I understand the pressure. I understand, but your heart, the heart behind this question, let's talk about what you're really asking here. You're asking, what's the most I can get away with? Like, what's the most I can do and still be a Christian? And I would always be like, man, the most you can do, let's see, David, he committed adultery, killed his lover's husband, and lied. I guess you could do that. Is that what you want? Is that what you want? Or what's the least I can do and still be a Christian? What's the least I can do? Well, the thief on the cross next to Jesus, he did nothing. He did nothing. He looked at Jesus the last gasping second of his life. He lived his whole life as a thief for himself. The last second of his life, he looks at Jesus and says, remember me. And Jesus says, today you'll be in paradise with me. So is it possible that you could live your entire life in selfishness, addicted to lust, living evil, and then the last second look at Jesus and be saved? It's possible. Is that the life you want to live? Why are we plotting to sin as much as we can? Why are we scheming to see how little we can follow Jesus in this life? That's not life. That's not freedom. So the Apostle Paul says, I have the right to do anything. Yes, you do. You do. But not everything's beneficial. I have the right to do anything. Yes, you do, but I will not be mastered by anything. Do you hear the questions here? He's going to say, yeah, your freedom has to be qualified by a couple things. One, is it beneficial? Is it good for you? Is it good for others? If it's not loving, why would you possibly want to do it? And the second question, will it master you? The question is not, can I do it? The question is it beneficial? Will it master you? G.K. Chesterton, who's one of my favorites, old-time author. He's kind of like the pre-C.S. Lewis, all right, if you've never heard of him. G.K. Chesterton was a man who famously enjoyed cigars and scotch. So it's not surprising that he says this quote. He says, in the name of freedom, a man will declare, I will do what I want. I will drink scotch and smoke cigars as often as I wish. But if this man drinks and smokes as often as he wishes, soon the only freedom he will know is deciding which type of scotch to drink and which kind of cigar to smoke. For he will not have the freedom to go a day without scotch and cigars. In the name of freedom, people enslave themselves every day. If I always do whatever I want to do, I will become a slave to my own desires. I will become a slave to selfishness. And this is particularly true of sexual desires. This is particularly true. We are hardwired in this. Hardwired in. Paul says you will never find true freedom by doing what you want. You say food for the stomach and the stomach for food, and God will destroy them both. So he goes to the next quote and says, okay, let's think about this. You're saying sex is like a bacon cheeseburger. Get this, follow this. This is what they're saying, because they are comparing it. Because Paul would say food for the stomach and stomach for the food, because that means you don't have to follow Jewish ritual laws, Jewish food laws. You don't have to follow that. So to a Jew, that's an abomination. But I'm a Christian. To me, that is an act of worship. I'm worshiping right now. All right? Just preparing for it. Speaking of food pornography last week, here you go. Sex is like eating a bacon cheeseburger. It is a veritable act of worship, they would argue. This is what it's like. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just a physical act. It doesn't touch my soul. And then if you look at that second half, he says, and God will destroy them both. And they would say, here's the deal. It's just my body. My body's going to rot in the grave someday. It's going to be gone. My soul goes to heaven. Body rots in the grave. So here's the thing. I can do whatever I want with my body. My soul belongs to Jesus. All right? That's the logic. But Paul begs to differ. He says, the body, however, your body is not meant for sexual immorality. And then begs the question, well, what is it meant for then? It sure feels like it was meant for that. But for the Lord. And the Lord is for the body. Now, I don't want to lose Paul's argument chain here because it's brilliant, but I do want to stop right here, and I want you to hear the Lord is for your body. I think if we actually believe this, it would change everything about God's prohibitions for sex and about his commandments around it. God is not against your pleasure. He is not against your body. He's for it. He created it. He designed it. He's not against your desires. He wants you to fulfill the deepest desires of your heart. But he knows that just chasing cheap sexual acts, pornography, masturbation, those things will not satisfy, will not lead you to the place where you want to go, to the place you're called to be. He is not against you. He's for you. He's for you. By his power, God raised the Lord from the dead. How did Jesus rise from the dead? Was it spiritually or bodily? Bodily. Bodily resurrection is what we believe in. And he will raise us also. How are you going to raise from the dead? Is it going to be spiritually or bodily? Bodily. So I wait to see Paul's point here, what Paul's getting at. They said, sex is just something that happens in my body. It's no big deal. My body's going to rot in a grave someday. Who cares? It's like a cheeseburger. And Paul says, last I checked, my body was united with my soul and one person that we call me. Last I checked, I couldn't do anything with my soul that didn't bring my body along, and vice versa. That a person, body and soul, then if they give their life to Christ, they're united with Christ. So did Christ die just for your soul or for your soul and your body? And the answer is both. Did he raise from the dead to save your soul or save your body? And the answer is both. That Paul is saying the real problem here, I want you to hear this because this is going to be so penetrating when we talk about every other topic. The real problem here is not that they're having casual sex. The real problem is that they have a wrong view of what it means to be human. So for the Corinthians, this was a deep influence from the Greek philosophers. Athens, the center of Greek philosophy, was just 50 miles away. Short trip. In fact, when the Apostle Paul came to Corinth originally, he passed right through Athens. We read about that in the book of Acts. So, most famously, but very, very ubiquitous from Athens, Plato. You probably heard of him. He taught that your soul is the real you. It is essential. It is real. It is substantial. But the body is deceptive, temporary, a shadow. That the body is the prison of the soul, his words. And we call this the soul body or the mind-body dualism. And it's super popular. They would divide soul good, body bad, soul permanent, body temporary. They would divide this up, and this is really popular. It's called mind-body or soul-body dualism is the language. It's super popular among the Greeks, not just those who followed Plato, but the Cynics, the Stoics, and others. Now, careful. I'm not saying the Corinthians were all philosophers. They weren't. They probably didn't study philosophy at all. They might not have ever heard of this, but I am saying that they were deeply influenced by Greek philosophy, just like us. Just like us. If you grew up in the Western world, you've been deeply, deeply influenced by this. You may never have read Phaedo, but if you grew up in the West, you've been deeply influenced by this most unbiblical idea that the real you is your soul and not your body. That what really matters is your soul, not your body. And nowhere is this more confusing or damaging than in sexuality. So this past week, my wife, she's substituting at her local elementary school, and she was helping some third graders do a reading project. And they're reading this book, on lions. And it has like this description of boy lions with their mane and the girl lions. And they start talking about the difference between boy and girl lions. And this little third grade boy says to her, "Oh, but you should never ask about someone's gender. That's rude." So I promise you this third grade boy has never read The Republic. He does not know Plato. But this boy is already an expert in dualism. He already knows that what really matters is the unseen, not the body. He already knows that in America 2018, your real gender is what you feel deep in your soul and not what your body says. Now, I don't mean to oversimplify this. I'm going to be the first to admit that in Western culture, we have concocted some terrible caricatures of what it means to be male and female, boy and girl. We need to be so careful when we discuss this, when we attempt to define these terms. And can I just say, I know our church. If you struggle with gender dysphoria, I can't imagine how hard and confusing and painful this must be. And my heart goes out. So I don't say this to make fun of anyone. I don't say this to take this lightly. All I want to point out is this: defining our gender by immaterial requires a radical dualism. It is choosing the soul over and opposed to the body, just like the Corinthians. Just like the Corinthians. The scriptures in general and the Apostle Paul, they will not allow for this, though. If you read through the scriptures, you are not a soul trapped in a body. You are a human. And a human is body and soul. You cannot choose your body or your soul. So any activity you do with your body, you do with your soul. And with your soul, you do with your body. So eating, going to the bathroom, shopping, worshiping, having sex. These are physical, spiritual activities. Because you're a physical, spiritual being. Make sense? The body in the scriptures is not bad. It is not bad. God likes bodies so much, he took one for himself. Huh? That's what Christmas is about. Merry Christmas. God took on flesh. He's incarnate, which we all know is the Spanish word for really excellent dip. Or meat, flesh. He took on flesh. He's concarne, God concarne. Yes, we needed that. So God the Son takes on flesh, lives a human life, which means he has a body and a soul, just like every single one of us. And then he dies a human death, which means his body and soul are ripped apart, just like it's going to happen to every one of us if Jesus doesn't return. His body was laid in a tomb, and his soul, according to the Apostles' Creed, descended into hell. What does that mean? Does it mean he was tortured in hell? No. It means his soul, the human soul, entered into Sheol, the place of the dead, because that's what happens to every single human when they die. Their body and souls are ripped apart, and that's what happened to his. And then 3 days later, God up from the grave, he arose, right? I always get my grammar. Does he rise, rose, risen? Anyways, he up from the, and how does he rise? He rises embodied. He eats, he drinks. You can touch him, you can feel him. He's a body. Now, is he different? Yes, he's glorified. What does that mean? We're going to get there in 1 Corinthians. The point being, God loves body and souls. And so, God, listen to this. He doesn't just want to save your soul. He wants to redeem you. Body and soul. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? Shall I then take the members of Christ and unite them with a prostitute? Do you not know that when you give your life to Christ, that your body, this body, become the members of Christ? That we say you are the embodiment of Christ. That if you give your life to Christ, something mysterious happens, that you become the hands and feet of Jesus. That when you go out in the world, people meet Jesus through you. They hear Jesus through you. They experience Jesus through you. You are the very embodiment of Jesus Christ. Romans chapter 6, when the Apostle Paul talks about what it means to live for Christ, he gets all anatomical. You ever notice this? He says, therefore, offer the parts of your body. He's talking about tongues and feet and ears and everything. Offer the parts of your body as instruments of righteousness, literally weapons of righteousness. Weapons that serve a new kingdom and a new king. Your body parts. What's our spiritual act of worship? The Apostle Paul says, your spiritual act of worship? Offer your bodies as living sacrifices. Do you hear that? Spiritual act is offering your body. Jesus doesn't just want your heart, he wants your body. Therefore, giving our parts, which are the physical embodiment of Jesus Christ on the earth, giving those and using those in service to sinful lust, uniting them with a prostitute, is uniting parts of Jesus with a prostitute. Disturbing. Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? For it is said, the two will become flesh. Now, Paul says this, don't you realize that when you sleep with a prostitute, or anyone outside of marriage, let's just be clear here, he's not just talking about prostitution, sex outside of marriage, when you do that, you are becoming one with that person. And he quotes Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, the two will become flesh. He uses the seminal, the foundational verse on what marriage is in the scriptures. And he says, it's not just marriage though. That reality affects you every time you have sex, whether it's in marriage or with a prostitute or with a group of people. That's what's happening to you. You can tell yourself, it's just physical. It's no big deal. But it's not true, is it? You cannot have sex with your body without having sex with your soul. You cannot have sex with another person without, in some sense, fusing your souls, fusing your whole life, total intercourse. You can't do it. Now, let me be careful. Some pastors and scholars have gone too far on this. Does it mean that if you have sex with someone, you're automatically married to them? Probably not. That is probably not the Apostle Paul's point. We can't tell. He doesn't really flesh this out much. But what we can say is that the Apostle Paul is going to make it really, really clear that all sex, even casual sex, forms you at the deepest levels and has a lasting impact that is more than just bodies. For whoever is united with the Lord is one with him in spirit. So do you see what the Apostle Paul just did? He just said, you unite yourself with a prostitute and you're one with her, but whoever's with the Lord is one with him. Do you see what he just did? He slid from sexuality to spirituality, just like that. From sexual oneness to spiritual oneness. Like it might remind you of a chart we looked at last week. Right here, that sexuality and spirituality, they point to one another. They're parallel longing. So Ephesians chapter 5, Romans chapter 7, we're going to see the same thing made explicit. That when a husband and wife come together in total intercourse, physical, spiritual, emotional, psychological, when they share themselves economically, socially, psychologically, it's supposed to point us to Christ. That it reminds us of the mystery that we can be united with Jesus himself. That sex is supposed to point us to freedom, pleasure, peace, life, to God himself. But the Apostle Paul said this can be so easily inverted. That false sexuality leads to a false spirituality. That when we make it selfish, when we just share our bodies and we say we're not going to share our souls, it becomes monstrous. Something happens that inverts the whole thing, and suddenly it becomes about slavery, pain, alienation, death. Same thing, flipped over. So Paul says, flee from sexual immorality, run from it. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. I'm just going to say that second half, all other sins a person commits are outside the body. We're not exactly sure what that means. And I don't want to take a guess because the best of the best scholars are kind of like, I don't know. Some think the Apostle Paul might be, that first half might be actually quoting the Corinthians there. That might be something they say. All sins a person commits are outside the body. Could be. We're not quite sure. What is absolutely clear from this verse is this. Sexual sin in particular is damaging. It is so hard to heal from. It is enslaving and destructive. Unlike almost anything else. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Don't you know who you are? You're a temple. God himself resides in you. Don't you know whose you are? Do you know that Jesus, when he died on the cross, he died for you? He paid the price, the ransom price, to purchase you back. He paid for you. You're his. And if you give your life to him, you are his with a great future. How could you possibly then, unite yourself with a prostitute or go seek something cheap when it's supposed to be pointing you to the greatness of Jesus? Therefore, he ends, therefore honor God with your bodies. And that's the application. Honor God with your bodies. Your body matters. It matters to God. He wants to redeem it. What you do with the stuff in your pants matters to God. It matters deeply. It will affect you. It will change you. It will change your family. It will change your future. It matters to God. So I want to tease out 3 really basic applications from this that come right out of the text so that we can leave with something to do here. And the first one that is right out of the text is this. Don't be dumb. I want you to notice something. The arguments of the Corinthians are dumb. They are. Like, we are all now stupider for having heard them. Like, really? You're going to say freedom in Christ means you can sleep with a prostitute? Really? That's your argument? Really? You're going to say sex is like eating a cheeseburger? That's dumb. Don't be dumb. And how does Paul respond to this? He says, don't you know, don't you know, don't you know? 3 times. A very Jewish way of answering this, right? Don't you know, don't you know, don't you know, don't you know? And I just, here's my point. There is something about sexual temptation that makes us dumb. Even the most brilliant people can be brought to utter stupidity when it comes to matters of sex. And I don't think this is just coincidental. Romans chapter 1, the Apostle Paul will directly connect sexual desires and self-deceit. There's something about sex that leaves us open to deception, open to believing dumb arguments, open to believing our own lies. This is well documented throughout the scriptures. Judah, Samson, David, these are brilliant men who seem to lose all cognitive ability in front of a woman. All right? Biologically, there is potentially some really solid neurological grounds for this. Just the other day, NPR, there was a report on what brain activity in women who are viewing porn. Of course, this study was done in the Netherlands, of course. And so it turns out that if you view like a normal movie, there's lots of prefrontal cortex activity going on. And if you view like something kind of like what they call soft core, like it's still some going on. But as soon as you switch over to hardcore porn, the women's brain, the prefrontal cortex goes out for a coffee break. Which is to say, all your rational reasons, your sense of personality, all the things that you would say are really you, they go out, checking out, bye-bye. This is on top. 2014, there was a study published. I love this. Study published in the Journal of American Medical Association for Psychiatry. A big peer review article, all right? So real study. And they found that looking at porn habitually literally makes a man's brain shrink. It's crazy. So this brings me to this. Karl Barth. Karl Barth, you may not know his name. He's a big deal. He is one of, if not the leading theologian from the 20th century. He started a whole movement, wrote some of the most brilliant works that you will find. And in particular, his groundbreaking work on human sexuality in the image of God is brilliant. Dogmatics, Volume 3, you should read it. You will be hard-pressed to find in the history of the church a person who has thought more precisely and thoroughly on what the Bible teaches on human sexuality. He single-handedly did some of the greatest work in the history of the church on the theology of sex. And according to a series of recently released personal letters, he also did his secretary. I want you to hear this. He spent several decades of his marriage. This just came out a couple years ago. Several decades of his marriage writing theology and having wild affairs with his secretary. And this is not even the worst part. It gets worse. Listen to this. In those letters, that he writes to his secretary, he justifies their activity as somehow godly or right. He goes to great lengths to write a theological justification to convince himself and her that they were not sinning. Can I say, that's dumb. That's dumb. Do you hear this? You can be literally the most brilliant person in the universe and be dumb on this stuff. This is especially true, I'm sorry guys, but it's especially true of college students. I mean, I've had college students, young men and women come to me proposing that we reinterpret our sexual ethic through a trajectory hermeneutic based on the Zitzum-Leben of ancient Ephesus. And I immediately look at them and think, oh man, you must really want to have sex. That's what I think. Here are just a few of the dumb questions college students have asked me. You ready? Oh, this is good. What if we're married in our hearts? To which I say, great, then you can have sex in your hearts. If you want to have sex with your body, though, you got to marry her body. But what if, let's just say, like, they had some rare, like, actual ethical question here. What if they had some, like, rare disease, and the only thing that could save them was having sex? And I'd be like, well, get married to go to their funeral. What if we're the only two people left on earth? I'm like, a zombie apocalypse? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, well, get married or let the human race perish. I'm sorry, guys. Sex outside of marriage is sin. Period. The scriptures are so painfully clear on this that there is no way around it unless you want to believe your own lies. Don't be dumb. Make sure you're listening to the right voices. Make sure you have someone in your life who isn't going to waver over the latest book or the latest podcast. If you are having sex outside of marriage, it's not the end-all, be-all sin, but you do need to repent. You need to recognize it as sin. And if you're currently with someone who tells you that sex outside of marriage is not sin, you need to get away from them. You need to. They're deceived. If you've concocted some theory that makes sex outside of marriage okay, I'm just telling you, you're deceived. Don't be dumb. Number 2, run for your life. If you lay out the biblical teaching on temptation, you will find phrases like this. Fight the good fight. Endure. Put on the full armor of God. Take your stand. Take captive every thought. Persevere. But when it comes to sexual sin, he's like, run! Flee! Get out of here! Save yourself! I don't think this is accidental. Now, listen, I'm not saying that it's impossible to fight sexual temptation head on. From time to time, we must all do this. If you ever leave your house, if you ever get on the internet, if you ever watch TV, if you ever eat Uncle Ben's rice, you will be tempted. But I am saying this. If you don't plan for your weakness, if you don't plan to avoid temptation when it comes up, you're planning to fail. It's just a matter of time. If you keep having those one-on-one meetings with members of the opposite sex or whoever you're attracted to, if you let that person flirt with you and you don't cut it off, if you read those novels or watch those movies and press play without actually looking what the content is, if you surf the internet without accountability, it's just a matter of time. You're planning to fail. You need to plan for your weakness. You need to avoid those situations. You need to have an escape route mapped out. Run. Flee. And the last, which I think is just crucial that the Apostle Paul ends on this, it's remember not who you are, but remember whose you are. No matter what you've done in your past, sex doesn't own you. And sex does not define you. Jesus does. If you've given yourself to him, you're his. All of you, body and soul, you are his hands and you are his feet. You are declared to be holy. You are loved and you are being redeemed. That's who you are. That's whose you are. Let's pray. Father, I pray, Lord, as we close out this very difficult topic and a topic that we so are prone to self-deceit, prone to wander. So tempted in every way, Lord. I pray, God, that you would speak to us. I pray, God, that you would give us a spirit of repentance, a spirit of faith, Lord, that we would hear your words, that you're for our body, you're for us, you're on our side, and that would stir in us. And then, God, I pray that we would hear the truth spoken over us, whose we are, we're yours, that Jesus bought us. God, I pray that we'd be changed by that. God, I'm just going to trust your Spirit to apply this to each one of us as we need it. You're good. Thank you. Amen.